Hey everyone, Tankenstein here. In this video, I'll be reviewing the CV9035NL, though I'll probably just refer to it as the NL throughout this review. This is a currently 9.7 BR rank 7 squadron light tank in the French Ground Forces tech tree. The NL currently costs either 540,000 squadron RP to unlock, or 7,800 golden eagles at max to purchase outright. With that said, in this video, I'll be going over everything that you need to know about this light tank, including its stats, how it plays, I'll go over its strengths and weaknesses, I'll give it some scores in several key areas, and then I'll give my final recommendation on if I feel that this vehicle is worth purchasing or not. With that said, if you like this kind of video, please consider subscribing, but without further ado, let's get into the review. Now to start, I'll place the stat card here on the side of the screen. Important things to note about this vehicle are its overall mobility, its armor thickness, and its armament. Now for how it plays. Because of the light armor and the 35mm cannon with just 131mm of armor pen at max, the CV9035NL essentially needs to flank in order to play. It cannot survive head-on encounters with most tanks, especially MBTs, nor can it damage most MBTs from the front. Rather, this vehicle forces you to have to flank wide to hopefully avoid well-armored vehicles, to then be able to pen their weak side and rear armor. While the NL is quite good once it gets into a flanking position, being able to do so is not guaranteed, as the mobility on this vehicle isn't quite what one would hope for with an autocannon this weak. Quite simply, while it is a quick vehicle, it oftentimes isn't quick enough to be able to reach a flank before the enemy, or to avoid MBTs whilst doing so. Not only this, but the turret traverse rate is mediocre for a tank of this type, and will not be able to respond to light tanks as quickly as it should be able to. Put simply, this is a vehicle that needs speed in order to succeed, and it doesn't really have much of it. Again, it isn't terrible in that regard, but so many light tanks, especially wheeled light tanks, completely outclass the NL, so even if you do reach a good spot to start flanking the enemy, there's a good chance that another light tank already has eyes on you and is about to kill you, which will force you to be hyper aware at all times while playing this vehicle. Again, it's quick, but I don't feel that it's quick enough to have an autocannon as its one and only weapon. Because of this, the roles that you should play are support, base capping, and flanking, with flanking being the best role to play if you want to score, but also the most dangerous with this vehicle. Unfortunately, because of the not amazing mobility, it brings the armament down a notch, making it so that it isn't as effective as it should be. Thankfully, so long as you shoot first, the NL is still a great vehicle to take out lightly armored vehicles with, as the autocannon should be powerful enough to take them out from any angle and at any range, which makes the NL a semi-effective light tank destroyer. Now with that said, let's get into the strengths and weaknesses. And first for the strengths. And bear in mind, this is pretty much the same vehicle as the DK, except with some changes, so most of the strengths and weaknesses are going to be very similar or the same. Now again, for the strengths, the interior is filled with spall liners, as well as 10mm thick internal armor, which can help to stop nearly inert shells and fragmentation. Second, this vehicle has Gen 3 thermals for both the gunner and the commander. Third, it has the front-mounted engine that will oftentimes absorb enemy shells. Fourth, the NL has decent ammo versatility with APF SDS, HEIT, APIT, and even APDS shells. Beyond this, the interior of the vehicle is extremely clean with plenty of empty space, especially in the back, and only has a very small ammo box underneath the turret, as well as a single, albeit fairly large, fuel tank on the side of the vehicle. Sixth, this is a smallish vehicle, but not so much that it will give you a major advantage. Seventh, it has scouting and drone capabilities. For its 8th strength, it has good vertical cannon guidance of between -8 and +37 degrees. And finally, this vehicle features an autoloader. Now for its weaknesses. The CV9035NL has an extremely loud engine. Second, it has incredibly thin armor that can be penned by almost anything that is not an LMG. Third, the 9035 lacks IRST auto tracking, which means that it lacks the ability to automatically lock onto aircraft, which in turn greatly diminishes your ability to be a backup SPAA. Many autocannon carrying light tanks around this BR have this feature. Fourth, the turret is totally unprotected in that it has paper-thin armor and lacks the spall liner and anti-fragmentation armor that the hull of the vehicle has. Worse yet, it has 2 crew members sitting in the turret, and it's cramped. For its 5th weakness, the 35mm APF SDS shells only have 131mm of armor pen at very most, which is poor at this BR. Because of this, it means that most MBTs that you'll come across are virtually immune to your cannon from the front. Beyond this, it has a poor turret traverse speed, at least for this type of vehicle, with it being between about 24.5 and 34.9 degrees per second, depending on crew skill. For its 7th weakness, Gunner's optics only have up to 8 times zoom, while Commander's optics only zoom up to 6 6 times. For its 8th weakness, it oftentimes has mediocre post-pen damage that will sometimes require many shots in order to kill an enemy. 9th, you only have 3 crew members, which limits survivability. And finally, you only have a 35 round magazine, which is fired through extremely quickly at 200 rounds per minute, which means that you then have a 10-second reload, which is not good when you have no armor. Now with that said, let's get into how I score this vehicle. And for armament, I give it a 3.5 out of 10. On a vehicle that features an autocannon, how good your armament is comes down to a few different factors. These are how much armor pen you have, how mobile your vehicle is, and quite honestly, how lucky you are. First, the armor pen on this vehicle isn't very good, with just 131mm at max. This could be overlooked if the mobility was superb, but it isn't. It's very good, but not always good enough to be able to allow you to flank and hit the sides of unexpected MBTs. Finally, luck is something that you largely cannot control, but if you're unlucky enough to have to fight an MBT from the front, you're basically dead in the water. Because of these things, the armament just isn't that good. For comparison, the Japanese CTWV RCV, which has just a 30mm autocannon with the same fire rate, has a substantially better armament because of the mobility being far superior to the NL. Plus, it has much better optics, better turret traverse, and a shell magazine that's nearly 2.5 times larger than what's found on the NL, which means that you have much greater volume of fire, at least sustained. The NL is just too slow to properly be able to synergize the mobility and firepower for it to be consistently good, at least against more heavily armored enemies like you'd find with a wheeled light tank. Now for mobility, I give it a 6.5 out of 10. Believe it or not, the mobility on this vehicle is worse than its Swedish tech tree brother, the CV9035DK, because it weighs 2 tons more without seeing any horsepower increase. The mobility on this vehicle, don't get me wrong, is still very good, but falls quite a bit short. That 2 tons of extra weight makes a difference, and as the game sees increasingly faster ground vehicles, the NL is being left behind just a bit. It's still largely able to get the job done, but as stated before, it just isn't quick enough to rely on its speed all the time to be able to do things that light tanks typically do, like scouting, flanking, and base capping. Because of this reduction in mobility, likely due to the addition of a laser warning system, the armament is also a touch worse than what the DK version of the Swiss tech tree has. The armament relies on its mobility to be effective, and when the mobility is just a bit worse, so too is the armament. Now for the survivability, I give it a 3.75 out of 10. Hey everyone, Tankenstein from the future here. Just wanted to kind of revise that score real quick. Instead of a 3.75 out of 10 for survivability relative to other similar vehicles, I'll give it about a 4 or even a 4.25 out of 10 so far as survivability is concerned, simply because it has side pro composite armor, which is something for whatever reason I did not take into account when I initially wrote the script for this video, and that can defend against things like HMGs and some more heavily angled and weaker autocannon shots from the side and also from the front. The survivability on this vehicle is barely better than what you'd find on its near exact twin in the Swedish ground tech tree, again the CV9035DK, and that's due simply to the addition of a laser warning system. I'm tempted to drop it down to 3.5 out of 10, but I'll give the NL the benefit of the doubt. Outside of the laser warning system, the NL is no different than the DK. It has a large amount of spall liners, a good amount of empty interior space, a useful engine block that will stop some of its shells in their tracks, and surprisingly good frontal armor that isn't properly shown on the stat card, as it has multiple layers that have around 80mm of armor protection versus APF SDS. It isn't great, but it's something and will help to deflect some shots. Otherwise, the NL is pretty killable in all places, especially with a lackluster 3-man crew. Now overall, I give it a 4.5 out of 10. The CV9035NL is slightly worse than the DK, as it has lesser mobility, which essentially makes the armament worse, and only has a new laser warning system to show for it. It helps, but just barely. With that said, with an armament that'll make most MBTs impervious from the front, and mobility that won't consistently allow you to flank said MBTs to hit their side armor, the CV9035NL is just mediocre. The armament will shred enemies when you're able to position yourself to do so, but that likely won't be as common as you'd like, due to the good but not amazing mobility. Barring a BR decrease, which I could see making the NL into about a 5 out of 10 overall, which is just very average even still, this will remain mediocre, as it's a slightly worse version of the premium Swedish tech tree brother, which is also mediocre. Now with that said, for my recommendation, do I feel that you should purchase this vehicle with Golden Eagles, or should you use Squadron RP in order to obtain it? Well, if you're going to use one of those ways, I'd say just use Squadron RP, but this vehicle in its current state and at its current BR isn't really worth either. The NL is, in my opinion, a low priority vehicle to research. The Japanese Squadron vehicle CTWV RCV is much better than this vehicle, vehicle and is well worth putting your RP into. Heck, the Leopard 2PL, JF-17 Thunder, ME-262A1U1, T-80U, and so many other vehicles are far better to unlock with your Squadron RP than the CV9035NL. This is not an outright bad vehicle, as it will have its moments of being very successful, especially if you manage a proper flank before being intercepted by an MBT or an even faster light tank, both scenarios of which are likely, but the NL is just not mobile enough to make great use of its cannon. This would be a great armament if only the NL was a wheeled vehicle, but alas, it isn't. So because of that, I cannot recommend this vehicle for purchase via Golden Eagles, and would only research it via Squadron RP after you've already researched many other vehicles, probably almost all of them. It also does not receive my Tankenstein seal of approval. It just isn't good enough to warrant any accolades, at least in my opinion. Now with that said, thank you all so much for watching. If you don't mind, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel, as they both help me tremendously. Also, let me know what you think of my review and of the CV9035NL in the comments below. Either way though, thanks again, and I'll see you all on the other side. Take care everyone.